Zebra Family channel. If you have not subscribed, please click the like button, share and subscribe. It's free. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening wherever you are around the world. This is Zebra Family channel. Have you subscribed to the channel? If not, please subscribe, like and share. I'm bringing you the story of ANC MBALULA. He was in the media. He was trying to explain about the GNU. There's something that made me laugh and always remember Julius Malema and the educated guys from the EFF that cannot sign any document without reading it. That's why I respect EFF. We see graduates in EFF. And EFF is always telling its members, go to school. Go to school. It is a disgrace. I don't know whether it's because ANC has been using too much cadres. People they knew that they will get job even if they don't go to school. They always believe that because ANC will deploy them because they use the cadre system. Now we see MBALULA doing something that is uncalled for, Secretary General of the ANC. He signed documents without reading them. He was tricked by DA, and they are laughing at him now. Because how we knew about this, Clement was interviewing him. And you will listen to the interview of him failing to answer simple questions that are in the document that he signed. What is the meaning of that? Secretary General of the biggest organization. I don't know whether ANC noticed that such documents, you involve lawyers to read the documents, sit down with the organization, make the organization or draft the document with the organization so that, or if the document was drafted by the GNU as a group, then you, before you sign it, you take the copy, everybody must take a copy and tell them that we will meet again, we need time to go and read this document. Then you take the documents to your lawyers and read that, then you can come back when you do your next meeting, you do a correction. Because when you seek legal advisor to advise you, it's not that because you are stupid. It means you are clever. You know that you cannot put your signature in something that you don't understand. This is exactly what MBALULA did. He put his signature in a document that he doesn't even understand. He was using the numbers that because they have more numbers, but forgetting that now, when it's a GNU, it's not a one-man decision or that political party's decision. It's a collective decision. I do not understand why MBALULA did this. Can anybody explain to me? Let's listen to how the interview went about.
MBALULA, thank you so much for making time for us. Welcome to Face the Nation.
Thank you, Clement, and all the listeners. Thank you for having us.
So tomorrow the president is going to be inaugurated. It's been a long, tough road for you as the ANC, I imagine for other political parties doing very tough negotiations. Are you ready for this new power-sharing deal over the next 5 years?
We are ready to embrace the outcome of the elections as we did at the announcement of the Election Results Center, followed by the statement of the President of the ANC. And we have embraced the moment, and we have been, journeying with this moment since the announcement of the results.
And I'm asking that question because things are going to be done completely different now. Ordinarily, the President, after being inaugurated in this context, would have to consult with the ANC, some alliance partners as well, before he constitutes that government. The difference now is that he's going to have to consult parties that are represented in the government of national unity that he's considering for some of those appointments. Is that a tricky part for the president? Does he still somehow maintain the power and that he usually has when he constitutes his government?
We have not considered in the past so many bigger political parties. We did, but have this practice of seeking to embrace and bringing in South Africans through their political parties who we think can make a contribution in government. We have gone way beyond the government of national unity to bring in people into our government. President Mbeki brought the Minister of Technology at that time, Date Musibudi Mangena from Azapo, which he had one seat. Subsequent to that, President Zuma in his government brought Conor Melda from the Freedom Front Plus. President Ramaphosa brought in Patricia de Lille. The process of consultation is not new. It's an involved process, the question of appointing cabinet, looking at broadly skills, and at the same time consulting the alliance and engaging is quite involved. In this instance, it will mean involvement with political parties that are in the government of national unity and discussing with the president.
Does that mean that the parties that are within the GNU have a say on which portfolios they prefer? Helen Zille told me that they think that it makes sense for John Steenhuisen to be appointed as minister in the presidency. She says during the negotiations they didn't push for the position of deputy president because to them they thought it makes sense for John Steenhuisen to be in the presidency.
The negotiations were not transactional. They were based on first shaping up the statement of intent. And then in terms of paragraph 16, it is very clear what we're talking about there. We talk about an inclusive government. And with respect to political parties, it will be done in consultation and engagement with the president in respect to the prerogative of the president. So that's what will actually happen.
But based on what you've discussed as the ANC and with the other parties that have signed this document, are you planning on giving the DA perhaps 3-5 positions? I mean, have you discussed the numbers, not necessarily the positions and ministries, but the numbers as to the IFP with the number of seats they have as to how many portfolios they can take?
I want to leave that to the president. Yes.
Okay. So do you still plan, though, as the ANC on occupying?
We believe that the government the president is going to constitute will be reflective of the principle of government of national unity.
Okay.
So the detail of it, I want to leave it to him.
Okay.
Because there is a principle of a prerogative that belongs to him that must not be diluted or undermined.
Let me ask broadly about, because as the ANC, you need to look after your interests. You need to look after even the commitments that you have made to the electorate. So are you planning on occupying strategic ministries, whether it's health, whether it's finance, whether it's education? As the ANC, do you believe that you must at least retain those strategic ministries or share them together with other members of the government of national unity?
First, before we talk about that, we have to look at how we configure government. Our plan as the ANC was that we're going to shrink government, we're going to reorganize government as per conference mandate, and then align certain ministries and strengthen them. With the arrival of the government of national unity, we've got to strategically look as to do we stay with what we have? Do we expand? Do we have a more leaner government? How are we going to constitute a government that is reflective of the principle that has been embraced so much by political parties of the GNU? So those are the things that we need to consider first. And then we come to the question of what then is strategic for the ANC, of course. What is strategic for the ANC, but over and above that, our emphasis is on national interest, rather than looking at inwardly what is in the interest of national interest is part of the commitment that we built in to the foundational principles of the government of national unity.
So you wouldn't have a problem with some of the political parties that are within the GNU occupying some of the strategic portfolios, whether it's finance, whether it's health, whether it's education, trade and industry, you name it, because you're saying as long as it's in the best interest of the country.
National interest, that's what is important, and at the same time, that is what is overarching that will actually be considered.
The PAC has become the latest party to join the GNU. Will they be accommodators as well in government?
the GNU joining, it's a question of what the party sees and what it commits to. So the PAC, before it joined, it had to look into the statement of intent. And in this particular instance, joining the GNU, it means you want to participate, you want to contribute, and this is what we're open to. So our government will be reflective of that, and the PAC is most welcome to participate in that government.
Okay, so to ask it again, just so to be clear, they've just joined because they show a commitment to be part of the government of national unity. Their statement said that they're joining the government of national unity because they don't want to be on the sidelines. They want to be part of the solution to ensure the land is somehow returned to the majority of people in this country. The suggestion I got from that statement is that they believe they'll be accommodated in some way.
They are not going to be accommodated. They will be part of the GNU. The question is in what form? And in this particular instance, the option abroad, it is government and it is equally the legislature. So it will, when the president deals with the detail and with due respect, engaging with the PSC, all of those issues will be ironed out, because the statement of intent talks about engagement with parties on a bilateral basis.
Okay. Are there other parties that you're looking at that you're still talking to be part of the government of national unity that are, for instance, still with the progressive caucus? Because that's where the PAC was, and they've now moved over.
We have invited all parties to participate from the onset, and we started with our engagement with the DA as the main contending parties, and we agreed on the statement of intent, and then others then joined. And in this particular instance, we have not been approached as the ANC beyond the exploratory and talks about talks, and parties firming up their positions. And others have said, no, we will contribute through the principle of supply and confidence agreements. We don't want to be part of government to show our support to the GNU. Supply confidence means we can take part in the legislatures, and in terms of us being guided by our own policies and principles, if we agree with this government in the direction it is going, we will not hesitate to support, but we don't want to be swallowed. We want to keep our identity. If we disagree, we will be on the sidelines. But we're not in a hurry to join any government with 2 seats and all of that.
Okay. Do you have other parties that have given you that position?
There are many who have given us that particular position, and that is most welcome. And we respect them for that particular viewpoint.
All right, let's talk about the issue of consensus. How are you going to deal with issues where there are ideological or policy clashes between you and the DA? Say you want to increase the national minimum wage, for instance, or you want to propose a policy amendment on BEE or on affirmative action, or you want to implement phase 3 of the NHI. How is that going to work if the DA doesn't believe that that's the way to go?
We believe that the GNU must take decisions on the basis of consensus should such issues actually arise, and then having engaged, it must determine as to what is the consensus out of the discussion in the GNU, and therefore that is confined to the executive, and it is defined by the principle broadly of 60% threshold. We don't only confine ourselves to 50%, which is just 2 parties. So we broaden it to include actually others. And then if 60% of those political parties who participate agree on this particular direction, then that will then be the decision in terms of the executive.
Yeah.
So that does not seek to replace the protocols and the way of doing things in the executive. Those that remain. Those remain in terms of the legislatures, and that consensus and reaching a decision relates to the executive.
Okay. So, in other words, you are not going to be able to do anything as the ANC without the approval of the DA. And I'm saying that because if 60%, because this document says where consensus is not possible, the principle of sufficient consensus must apply. Sufficient consensus exists when parties representing 60% of the seats in the National Assembly agree, as you've stated. So you already have 40%, the DA has 20%. You could very well put up a position in cabinet, for instance, where the IFP agree with you, the PAC, good party agrees with you, but that's not enough for you to pass that. You are still going to need the approval of the Democratic Alliance for the decisions that you make.
No, consensus and sufficient consensus is a deadlock breaking mechanism where there is an issue on the table and there is no agreement. But it does not in itself hamstrung the functioning of cabinet in terms of decision making. That is an understanding in terms of the statement of intent among political parties that for the goodwill and the smooth running and stability of the country, we will then look at matters from a point of view of deadlock breaking mechanism through a consensus or sufficient consensus. And sufficient consensus will only be reached after engagement, and that is it. So it is not about subjecting yourself and the DA vetoing cabinet. It is unconstitutional in a sense, unless if it is entrenched in the constitution. The state of intent determine how you function smoothly. Remember, the foundational principle overarching, among others, talks about stability, constitutionalism, and the rule of law. So we're not replacing the constitution. So in this particular instance, for the goodwill and the best and the good way of functioning of government, yes, you can come with issues and all of that, but if there is no agreement on some of the issues, then we will go through the route of sufficient consensus in terms of reaching a decision. So nobody vetoes the decisions of cabinet.
Okay,
cabinet will still take its own decisions.
But that decision of cabinet is taken based on the consensus of the parties in the government of national unity, right? Your majority as the ANC, because you don't have that anymore, and the fact that you've got the highest number of votes and you have 40% doesn't mean that if there was a disagreement, you can still go ahead and say this is a decision of cabinet. You still need the buy-in of the other parties in the GNU.
It is a deadlock breaking mechanism, and that is what I'm explaining. So it means a cabinet decision in itself cannot be vetoed by any other party. It means that political parties will debate, and the reflection of that discussion in the GNU will be taken by sufficient consensus.
But how do we reach that decision? So when you say a decision by cabinet, how do we reach it? Is it when you say, all right, 60% of us agree here, so that means that qualifies as a decision of cabinet?
That is the threshold we're actually talking about in terms of, it's a concession in this particular instance. And what it means is that 60% of political parties in the GNU will arrive at a decision and use sufficient consensus as a deadlock breaking mechanism should any of such arise.
Yes, and that's the point I'm making, that for it to be a decision, 60%, if there's no consensus, have to agree to that. You don't have that 60% with the IFP, the Good Party, the PAC. You need the DA to rubber stamp every time that there's a deadlock. For there to be 60% consensus, you need the DA to rubber stamp that. Without their numbers, you can't have a legitimate decision that you say this is a result of sufficient consensus.
No, it is incorrect. Cabinet does not function on the basis outside the realm of the constitutional prescript. And the question of goodwill in terms of functioning and smooth functioning and putting together the GNU government, it means where there are contradictions and issues that need to be resolved will be resolved by sufficient consensus. And in this particular instance, it does not mean that in the normal functioning of cabinet, from the point of view of how the executive has to function, it ceases to operate. We are talking about the concession in relation to how you break a deadlock, should there be any, where decisions have got to be taken.
Okay, let's be practical as my last question, because I want us to be clear and understand you well here. If, as the government of the government of national unity, you're working on a statement, you're discussing what's happening in the Middle East, you believe as the ANC that you must characterize as cabinet what's happening in the Middle East as genocide. The Democratic Alliance, with their 20% in that cabinet, say we don't agree with that. That's a deadlock, right? So for the president to come out and say this is an approved cabinet decision and I'm communicating it, When there has been a deadlock where the ANC says it's a genocide in the Middle East, the DA says it is not. Are you saying that even when the DA has said no with their 40%, the president can still come out and take that decision as sufficient and having been agreed by the collective, and it's still a legitimate decision that is reached to after consensus?
We are not talking about a negotiated political settlement here. We have long moved out of that. This is a GNU with special characteristics, in which we talk about the normal operation and functioning of government, which in itself is not hamstrung by the fact that for every cabinet member and decision to be taken, it will at all material times be subjected to disagreement. So the question is, should that actually arise, determined by the number of political parties that are there that participate? We have then put the question of sufficient consensus to arrive at the decision.
I agree with you, which is why in the beginning I didn't say every single cabinet decision. Of course, let's say 80% or 90% of the times you guys are going to agree. But the reality is there are policy differences, which is why I'm using the national minimum wage for a reason. I'm using the war in the Middle East for a reason, because that's where you don't see eye to eye. So in that 1 or 5% where you have fundamental differences in policy, how do you deal with it?
The minimum wage cannot be reversed.
Yeah, but that's it. I'm saying, what if you want to increase it by 1 rand? The DA doesn't believe in that.
The question is, there is no party that has got the veto power within the government of national unity. So for us to agree, it means that we put a threshold not of a single party. You must understand the 60% how it operates. Start with 50%, which would have included, if it was a grand coalition, 2 parties. But the fact that we have broadened that, reflective of the parties that are in the National Assembly to participate in the GNU, you have then raised the threshold to 60%. So it means of those parties that participate, that will determine broadly a bigger decision that needs to be taken within government.
And you as the ANC with 40%, let's say you've got the IFP, the DA, the PAC, the Good Party, that still doesn't give you 50%, does it? You need the DA. That's the point I'm trying to make.
It might as well happen that the DA disagrees, but I'm saying it does not have the veto power from not saying the decision cannot be taken. The threshold of 60% is of all the parties which will be participating.
And I'm saying you don't have the threshold of 60%. Put the DA aside. Take you, IFP, PAC, Good Party, PA. You don't have 50%. There's not much you can do on your own. At the end of the day, you are going to need the DA, even if it's just 10 members of the DA. You're going to need them in order to deal with any deadlock that you may have.
When you constitute government and you talk about 60% and political parties broadly that participate, the determination of the decisions, how they are taken in terms of cabinet, at the end of the day, should there be any other deadlock with regard to the executive, the deadlock breaking mechanism at your disposal is to negotiate and engage in a sufficient consensus. But it does not apply in terms of decision making such that the party can have a veto power over the executive decision making process.
Okay.
The question that must be interrogated, which is what I think you are in a hurry to make a determination about the DA veto, having veto in powers, is that a single political party cannot stop the operations of the executive in this unless institutionalized and reflected in the constitution of the country that that veto power, it is acceptable.
And the executive is the government of national unity, it's not the ANC, right?
The government of national unity is of all parties that participate.
Which is why you need an agreement. So as the ANC, when you say you can't stop the operations of the executive is not the ANC. The executive is the government of national unity. That's why those people need to agree. At the very least, 60% of them must agree. So but let's move on from it. I'm going to bring in Helen Zille, because Helen Zille actually told me that the ANC is not going to be able to do anything without 60%. They have 20%, you have 40%. The document you have signed says if there is there's a deadlock. At least 60% of parties must agree. And unfortunately for you as the ANC, the IFP, the Good Party, the PA, all the other smaller parties don't give you 60%. At the end of the day, you need the DA to come and rubber stamp whatever decision you're going to make. That's what's according to the document you've signed.
No, I think the interpretation of the decision, also in terms of our discussion, is what need to be clarified.
Okay.
And that is what is important.
All right, we'll hear from Helen Zille in a moment about how they interpret that. Much for making time for us this evening. And you've been waiting long because I was trying to get MBALULA, who is the Secretary General of the ANC, to understand a very crucial clause in this document that all of you have signed in this Government of National Unity. And that's where I want to start with you. The deadlock requires that there's sufficient consensus. When there's a deadlock reached, sufficient consensus means 60% of the parties that represent seats in the National Assembly have got to agree. MBALULA doesn't necessarily seem so. How do you interpret it as someone who was negotiating?
Clement, it's not parties with 60% of seats in the National Assembly. It's 60% of seats in the Government of National Unity. Mm-hmm. And so I interpret it the way you interpret it with Fikile when you were talking to him. It is all the parties who are in the Government of National Unity must reach consensus. Alternatively, 60% must.
Yeah.
And not 60% of parties, but 60% of parties. Let me just quickly read it to you. Parties to the GNU representing 60% of seats in the National Assembly. So they've got to be, first of all, be parties to the Government of National Unity.
Yeah.
And then those parties have to represent 60% of the seats in the National Assembly. That is, the Government of National Unity has to comprise 60% of the seats that the Government of National Unity parties have in the Assembly.
In practical terms, what that means is the ANC can't just come up with a position and then they say to the IFP, oh, vote with us here in cabinet, or for us to decide a government position, or let's bring in the Good Party as well. Ultimately, they're still going to need the DA because you are bringing in about 20% of support, and you carry weight in that Government of National Unity. Is there ever going to be a point where the ANC is able to pass through a resolution, let's say in cabinet or about the executive, without you giving it the green light as the Democratic Alliance?
Clement, we will represent at least 30% of the seats in the Government of National Unity, not 20, 30. The ANC will represent at least 60% of the Government of National Unity, but you have to do it looking at all the parties that are going to be in the Government of National Unity.
Yeah.
And it's only the parties in the Government of National Unity, so we're going to have 30% of, for example, all the seats if they do it by proportional representation and take the electoral results into account, which we've got there. But you're absolutely right. Without the Democratic Alliance, the ANC can't reach 60% of the seats in the National Assembly occupied by the Government of National Unity parties. It's complex, but you are right.
And if the ANC then brings in parties like the IFP and the Good Party and the PA and the PAC, who have now signed this document as well, do they reach that 60%?
No, let me say this, that the ANC can't bring people in that they feel like bringing in. This is another thing that Fikile doesn't seem to understand. Because it says that in keeping with the spirit of an inclusive GNU, it is agreed that the composition shall be discussed and agreed amongst the existing parties whenever new parties decide to be part of the GNU. Now, agreed means by sufficient consensus. So it's not the ANC that gets to invite everybody, as Fikile seems to think. He keeps on actually making public statements about this one's joined and that one's joined, but he must read clause 24 of the document that he signed.
Hold on. So are you saying to me that even when the PA decides to join, the ANC has had to consult you and the other parties in the Government of National Unity before accepting any other party to come and join and sign that document?
Absolutely. There are three founding members of this. It is ourselves, it is the ANC, and it is the IFP. And clause 24 says, in keeping with the spirit of an inclusive GNU, it is agreed that the composition shall be discussed and agreed amongst the existing parties whenever new parties desire to be part of the government of national unity. That's what it says in clause 24.
So were you consulted about the PA or the PAC?
We were consulted about the PAC, but not the PA. The PAC was raised in the negotiations. The PAC, Good, and the UDM were raised during the negotiations, but definitely not the PA. But, it's not about the PA per se, it's about the principle of this issue. They haven't consulted us, and the ANC must realize that they don't take all the decisions anymore. They didn't win the election.
So what does that mean now? Will you be taking it up with the African National Congress?
I have. I've written to Fikile MBALULA. I wish we'd been on together. I would have had a little bit of a debate with him. But I wrote him a letter yesterday. I got an acknowledgement of receipt. And basically I referred to clause 24. I said, you can't do this. And then I referred to clause 19, the sufficient consensus clause. So he says he'll get back to me, but I'm still waiting for that.
Okay, so when it comes to the constitution of government then, what happens if President Cyril Ramaphosa, for instance, gives the PA one or two ministries? Is that something that would dissatisfy you as a member of this government of national unity, given that you were not consulted about this party joining the GNU?
We have to be consulted about it. And in fact, it's crucially important to point out the clause on the cabinet. It says, that's clause 17. Whilst recognizing the president's prerogative to appoint members of the executive, such appointments should be done in consultation with the leaders of the respective parties of the members considered for appointment. So he can't just let anybody come in. He's got to consult with us, and then he makes the appointments in consultation with the leaders of the parties who have been accepted for admission into the government of national unity.
How extensive do you expect those consultations to be? Should he come to the DA and say, I've got 3 ministerial positions for you, this, and then consult you? Or do you expect him to say, okay, how do I constitute this government, and you as the DA give your own thoughts on which ministry you think should go to which individual or which political party?
Well, first of all, he can't come along to say we're going to give you 3 ministries, because he has to look at clause 16. Now, clause 16 says that it's a bit of a word salad, clause 16, because it was changed so often backwards and forwards, but it currently says, the government of national unity shall be constituted in a manner that reflects genuine inclusiveness of political parties that are party to the statement of intent and are represented in the National Assembly, broadly taking into account the number of seats parties have in the National Assembly and the need to advance the national interest. The President shall, in consulting the Executive, take into account the electoral outcomes. Now, if he takes into account the electoral outcomes of the parties that have already been admitted into the government of national unity by the processes that we've spoken about here, that means whatever the size of the cabinet, we're entitled to 30% of the seats, and the ANC is entitled to 60% of the seats.
Okay.
So you can't say here, well, I'm giving you 3. It doesn't work that doesn't work that way.
All right, so it has to constitute about 30%, which is what you are holding in the government of national unity. In numbers, just help our viewers understand, just to be practical in numbers, how many ministries are we talking here, based on how cabinet, how the executive is constituted at the moment?
Well, we don't know how big the cabinet is going to be. We want to reduce the size of the cabinet. So, of course, when you talk about how many seats we're going to get in the cabinet, it depends on how big this cabinet is. But however big the cabinet is, we should get about 30%.
So when you say you want to reduce the cabinet, what's your suggestion or recommendation to the president? What do you want to reduce it to?
Well, we haven't had discussions on that particular issue within the Democratic Alliance, but we think the current cabinet is too big.
Okay, so, all right, so that's one of the recommendations I suppose you're going to make to the president as he consults you as a member of the GNU.
Correct.
Okay. Do you Have you, as the Democratic Alliance, spoken about which ministries you think you can best serve in? I know you've already indicated that it makes sense for John Steenhuisen, for instance, to be the minister in the presidency. What else are you thinking about?
Well, you see, Clement, if I go and say so now, I'm not the leader of the DA, as you know, and our leader, John Steenhuisen, has to have discussions with the president. And it would be very wrong for me to preempt, to undercut him in that conversation. He has to have a free hand, and I don't want to give advance notice or anything like that. It would probably undermine John's ability to have the critical discussion that we need to have. So yes, that is going forward, and I expect that conversation to happen very soon. The president's being inaugurated tomorrow, and it's going to be very, very important for that discussion to happen on a level playing field, and that's why I don't think I should preempt it.
Yeah, but as it stands, you still stand by not the decision, because it's not a decision of the DA, but you still stand by what you think as the DA would make sense, and that is that John Steenhuisen should be minister in the presidency. That's what you think would be fair, because you also didn't push for John Steenhuisen to be the deputy president.
Well, you know, we don't push hard for ceremonial positions or things like that. We don't do that. We want to get on with delivering our manifesto to the benefit of all South Africans. That's what we want to get on with. And we certainly will look at the cabinet positions in relation to our manifesto and the commitments we've made to the voters.
Okay, let me ask you then about the impeachment of the president. What agreement did you get into the ANC with when it comes to the impeachment or possible impeachment of President Cyril Ramaphosa? Should the Phala matter be resuscitated?
Clement, as I mentioned on the radio this week, we didn't actually discuss that issue in the negotiations at all, but there is nothing in this agreement, this GNU agreement, that would prevent us from participating in an impeachment process. The critical question is only if the evidence warrants it. So, for example, if very incriminating evidence, provable evidence, comes before Parliament, then we would have to take a decision based on the evidence. Because there is nothing in this document that says that we couldn't participate in impeachment processes if it was necessary to do so on the basis of the evidence. I indicated that to you in our last conversation, but we're not going to be doing votes of no confidence, and that is a different thing.
Okay, so when I spoke to you on the radio this week, you said that we won't vote to impeach the president that we voted for. This was part of the agreement with the ANC, unless, of course, there's new evidence of criminality on the president. So when you say this was part of the agreement with the ANC, that you wouldn't impeach him on Phala unless there's new evidence, what do you mean?
That isn't an agreement. The question that we're not going to do is votes of no confidence, but impeachment issues is a different matter. And if there's evidence of criminality, then obviously you've got to act. We can't just sit there and say, oh, we're not going to do it. And the government of national unity could still continue. That would be a political decision as to whether we wanted to break it or not in those circumstances.
What do you mean when you say it would continue?
Well, the government of national unity is not dependent on one individual. The ANC could vote to impeach the president and it wouldn't matter to the government of national unity specifically.
What would happen if the ANC, the president is impeached? Like, is there someone in the government of national unity who would have to take over? What does your clause say in your document?
The ANC would have to elect somebody to take the president's place.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it would probably be the deputy president who's there, at least in an interim basis.
Okay. So the Phala matter is now in court. There's a possibility that the courts may say that government failed to deal with this matter properly. If it comes back, and then you are expected as Parliament, or Parliament is expected to then vote on that independent report by legal experts. As the Democratic Alliance, now that you're part of a government and you're no longer on the opposition benches, how do you vote? Do you vote because previously you voted in support of adopting that report? Does your position now change now you're in the GNU?
No, you'll remember that Judge Zondo said that Parliament must do its job in oversight of the executive. And the ANC needs to do it just as much as the DA needs to do it, just as much as any other party needs to do it. Because we have the separation of powers, the executive, the DA will be in the executive now, but we'll also have many, many members of Parliament and chairs of portfolio committees, and Parliament must do its job.
To be clear, though, the specific question I'm asking, Helen, is if that report comes back, the members of Parliament of the DA had voted to adopt that report so that there's a committee that is instituted where this matter of Phala Phala is dealt with. The ANC used its majority to push that down. Will you take the same position as the DA to say the report is now back, we would have voted this way in the beginning and we stand by that position now?
As you know, I'm not in Parliament, and I'm not the DA leader in Parliament, and I'm not the DA leader overall. My job is to manage the DA as a party. Like Fikile MBALULA, I am the Secretary General of the DA. But unless there is strong evidence to suggest that we shouldn't adopt the position we adopted the first time round, I don't see us being likely to change our position.
Okay. DA Federal Executive Chair, Helen Zille, thank you so much for your time.
What do you think about everything that happened there? Was Mbalula right to sign the document without reading them? Did he realize that he was signing a document that he was putting the organization in a long pit hole whereby nobody can pull it out? I love you, family. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Giti gini ngintanda mo tando love. Giti bravo, bravo, bravo.